Before we begin, a quick note about how this episode was created. This episode uses AI generated narration to bring Dr. Jackal's voice and character to life. However, the ideas, framing, and wording are my own. Dr. Alyssa R. Jones. The content has been synthesized, paraphrased, and adapted from history of psychology textbooks, scholarly work, lectures, professors, and other educational resources that have shaped my understanding of psychology, science, philosophy, and the mind. AI is used as a creative teaching tool, but the educational interpretation, organization, and teaching perspective come from me. Some wording may be condensed or adapted for clarity, accessibility, and narrative flow. This episode is designed to support learning, discussion, and historical engagement, and to invite students into the ideas, not replace the original sources. Welcome back to Dr. Jackal's History and Systems of Psychology podcast, where we trace the strange, brilliant, and occasionally messy road that made psychology into a science. I'm Dr. Jackal, your lab mascot guide through psychology's archives, arguments, weird side quests, and extremely opinionated theories of mind. Today's main character is William James, a man who somehow made psychology more scientific and more weird at the same time. And I mean that as a compliment. In this episode, we are not just memorizing a timeline. We are tracking how psychologists changed what counted as evidence, what counted as science, and what counted as the mind in the first place. Last time we explored Darwin, Galton, Romanese, Morgan, and Spencer. We saw how evolution shifted psychology toward adaptation, function, individual differences, and comparative psychology. Today we move into American functional psychology through William James. James is one of the most important figures in American psychology, but he is also one of its most complicated. He was brilliant. He was influential. He wrote beautifully. He helped move psychology away from structuralism, and he also had interests that made many scientific psychologists deeply uncomfortable. So today we are not getting a neat founder story, we are getting a contradiction, which, honestly, is very on brand for psychology. Part 1. William James, Psychology's Brilliant Contradiction. American functional psychology was preceded by the work of William James. James inspired later generations of psychologists and deeply influenced the functionalist movement. He was a pioneer of the new scientific psychology in the United States. Many psychologists considered him one of the most important figures in psychology after Wundt. He was widely regarded as the leading American psychologist. And yet, during his own lifetime, many psychologists believed he was a negative force in the development of psychology as a science. Why? Because James was interested in topics that many psychologists were trying very hard to push out of the field: mental telepathy, clairvoyance, spiritualism, communication with the dead, mystical experiences. James was curious about these phenomena. He did not simply dismiss them because they were strange, but figures like Titchener and Cattell criticized him sharply for this. From their point of view, psychology was trying to become a respectable science, and James was dabbling in exactly the kinds of phenomena they wanted psychology to leave behind. That is part of what makes James so interesting. He cared about science, but he also cared about human experience in its broadest, strangest, most difficult forms. He did not found a formal system of psychology. He trained no disciples in the sense Wundt did. He did not have a school of thought named after him. He was not primarily an experimentalist. In many ways, he was out of place in the increasingly scientific, experimental psychology of his time. And yet, his influence was enormous. Why? Because James could write. His book, The Principles of Psychology, had a clarity, magnetism, spontaneity, and charm that are rare in science. In that work, James presented one of the central ideas of American functionalism. The goal of psychology is not simply to discover the elements of experience. The goal is to study living people as they adapt to their environments. That is the shift. From structure to function. From parts to purpose. From isolated elements to living activity. Part 2. James against Wundt. William James opposed Wundtian goals for psychology, especially the attempt to break consciousness down into elements. James thought this missed the real nature of mental life. He offered a different way of understanding the mind, one that paralleled the functional approach to psychology. For James, consciousness has a function. It guides us toward the ends required for survival. Consciousness matters because human beings are complex organisms living in complex environments. Without consciousness, James believed human evolution could not have occurred. That is a Darwinian idea. Consciousness survives because it does something useful. It helps organisms adapt. James also emphasized the non-rational aspects of human nature. He did not believe human beings were purely rational creatures. We are creatures of emotion and passion, not just thought and reason. According to James, intellect can be affected by the body's physical condition. Beliefs can be shaped by emotional factors. Reason and concept formation can be influenced by human wants and needs. That is a major point. James did not think the mind was a cold logic machine. The mind is embodied, emotional, motivated, selective, practical, human. That makes James feel surprisingly modern. Part 3. The subject matter of psychology. In the Principles of Psychology, James defined psychology as the science of mental life, both of its phenomena and its conditions. That definition has two important parts. First, phenomena. This refers to the immediate experiences that make up mental life. Thoughts, feelings, sensations, memories, perceptions, desires, choices. Second, conditions. This refers to the bodily basis of mental life, especially the brain. James believed the physical substructures of consciousness were a basic part of psychology. Consciousness must be understood in its natural setting, the physical human being. That means psychology cannot study consciousness as if it floats separately from the body. The brain matters. The body matters. Biology matters. Physical condition matters. This biological awareness is one of the distinctive features of James's approach. He considered the action of the brain on consciousness to be central. In this way, James rejected what he saw as the artificiality and narrowness of Wundt's position. Wundt wanted carefully controlled analysis of immediate conscious experience. James wanted psychology to study mental life as it is actually lived, embodied, changing, selective, adaptive, and practical. Part 4. The Psychologist's Fallacy. James also criticized the attempt to identify elements of consciousness through introspection. He argued that conscious experiences are simply what they are. They are not naturally experienced as groups or collections of elements. If a trained observer in a psychology laboratory analyzes an experience into elements, that does not prove those elements exist independently in ordinary consciousness. This is what James called the psychologist's fallacy. The psychologist's fallacy occurs when psychologists confuse their own analytical standpoint with the actual experience of the person being studied. In other words, just because a trained psychologist can break an experience into parts does not mean the person's consciousness is naturally made of those parts. This is a direct attack on structuralist thinking. James argued that simple sensations do not exist in conscious experience in the way Wundt and Titchener assumed. Instead, they are products of inference or abstraction. We do not naturally experience the world as isolated dots of sensation. We experience meaningful, flowing, organized mental life. James therefore called for a new program for psychology. He argued that mental life is a unity. It is a total experience, and it changes. That leads us to one of his most famous ideas, the stream of consciousness. Part 5. The stream of consciousness. James believed consciousness is a continuous flow. Attempts to divide it into separate phases distort it. His famous term for this was the stream of consciousness. This is one of the most beautiful and influential metaphors in the history of psychology. Consciousness is not a box of mental blocks. It is not a tray of separate elements. It is not a cabinet full of sensations. It is a stream, moving, changing, continuous, cumulative. If James is right, then we cannot experience the exact same thought or sensation more than once. Even if the same stimulus appears again, our thought about it will not be identical because something has happened in between. Experience changes us. A second encounter is not the same as the first because the first encounter is now part of us. James described consciousness as cumulative, not recurrent. It builds, it flows forward, it carries the past with it. He also believed the mind is continuous. There may be gaps in time, such as sleep or interruption, but there are no sharp breaks in the stream of thought itself. Consciousness flows. This is very different from structuralism. Structuralism wanted to analyze consciousness into parts. James said that if you cut the stream into pieces, you lose what makes it a stream. Part 6. Consciousness is selective. James also argued that the mind is selective. We cannot attend to everything. At any given moment, we are exposed to far more stimuli than we can consciously process. So the mind selects. It chooses from the many stimuli available to it. Some experiences are filtered out, some are combined, some are separated, some are selected, some are rejected. Selection depends on relevance. The mind attends to stimuli that matter for our goals, needs, interests, and survival. This selective nature of consciousness helps mental life operate logically. It allows one idea to lead to another. It allows us to pursue goals. It allows us to reach conclusions. It allows us to function. Again, this is functionalism. James is not asking only what consciousness is made of. He is asking what consciousness does. It selects, it guides, it adapts, it helps us survive. Part 7. Conscious Choice and Habit. James placed great emphasis on the function or purpose of consciousness. He believed consciousness must have some biological utility. Otherwise, it would not have survived through evolution. Its function is to enable adaptation by allowing choice. James distinguished between conscious choice and habit. Conscious choice involves awareness, attention, and selection. Habit, by contrast, is involuntary and non-conscious. Habits are actions that have become automatic through repetition. This distinction is important because it shows how James connected consciousness, adaptation, and behavior. Not every action requires conscious control. Many behaviors become habitual, but consciousness is especially useful when we need to choose, adapt, respond flexibly, or face new situations. That purposeful emphasis reflects Darwin's influence. Consciousness is not just something that exists, it does something. It helps living beings adapt to complex environments. Part 8. James on method. James acknowledged the flaws of introspection. He accepted introspection as a less than perfect form of observation, but he did not reject it completely. He believed introspective results could be checked by comparing findings across multiple observers and using appropriate safeguards. James also accepted the experimental method as an important path to psychological knowledge. He thought experimentation was especially useful for psychophysics, the analysis of space perception, and research on memory. So James was not anti-science. He was anti-narrowness. In addition to introspection and experimentation, James recommended the comparative method. This meant studying psychological functioning across different populations: animals, infants, pre-literate peoples, as scholars of his era phrased it, emotionally disturbed individuals. The goal was to discover variations in mental life. This was very important for American psychology. In the principles, James made clear that functional psychology should not be restricted to a single method. Psychology should use whatever methods help us understand mental life. That broadened the scope of American psychology considerably. Instead of being locked into one laboratory method, psychology could use introspection, experiment, comparison, observation, and practical investigation. That methodological openness became one of functionalism's defining features. Part 9. Pragmatism. James also emphasized pragmatism. Pragmatism is the idea that the validity of an idea should be tested by its practical consequences. The pragmatic view is often summarized as, an idea is true if it works. Now, that does not mean true in a careless sense. It means we evaluate ideas by what they do in experience. What difference does the idea make? What consequences does it have? How does it guide action? Does it help us function, adapt, understand, predict, or solve problems? Charles Sanders Peirce advanced pragmatism first, but James wrote the book Pragmatism, which helped formalize the doctrine as a philosophical movement. This fits perfectly with functionalism. Functionalism asks what the mind does. Pragmatism asks what ideas do. Both approaches are concerned with consequences, usefulness, and action. This is one reason James was such a good fit for American psychology. American psychology became practical, applied, adaptive, and methodologically broad. James helped push it in that direction. Part 10. The James Lange Theory of Emotion. James also developed an influential theory of emotion. His theory contradicted the common view of emotional states at the time. Many people assumed the sequence was, first we feel an emotion, then our body responds. For example, I see a bear, I feel afraid. My heart races. I run. James reversed the order. He argued that bodily responses come first, and the feeling of those bodily changes is the emotion. So the sequence becomes, I see a bear, my body responds, my heart races, my breathing changes, my muscles tense. I experience those bodily changes as fear. For James, emotion is the feeling of bodily changes as they occur. He argued that without bodily changes, there would be no emotion. If heart rate, breathing, muscle tension, and other bodily responses did not occur, then the emotion itself would not exist in the same way. Carl Lange developed a similar theory at about the same time. That is why this view became known as the James Lange theory of emotion. This theory is important because it connects emotion to the body. Again, James is embodied. He does not treat the mind as separate from physical life. Emotion is not just a mental label, it is tied to bodily response. Part 11, James's theory of the self. James also wrote about the self. He suggested that the sense of self includes three major parts: the material self, the social self, and the spiritual self. The material self includes everything we call uniquely our own. This includes the body, family, house, clothes, and style of dress. James placed special emphasis on clothing. He believed clothing mattered because it's part of how we present ourselves and experience identity. Honestly, James would have had thoughts about branding. The social self refers to the recognition we receive from other people. James argued that we have multiple social selves. We present different sides of ourselves to different people. We may act differently with a student, a colleague, a parent, a friend, a partner, or a stranger. Other people see us differently from one another, so the self is not only inside us, it also exists in relation to others. The spiritual self refers to our inner, subjective being. This is the self of private consciousness, values, inner life, and personal identity. James's theory of the self is important because it is flexible and social. It recognizes that identity is not one simple thing. It is bodily, material, relational, and inward. That feels very modern. Part 12, Habit and the Nervous System. James also wrote powerfully about habit. He argued that habits become easier to perform with repetition and require less conscious attention over time. This is deeply functional. Habits free consciousness. If we had to consciously decide every small action, life would be exhausting. Imagine having to think carefully about every step of brushing your teeth, walking across a room, typing your name, or unlocking your office door. Habit allows repeated actions to become automatic. James connected habit to the nervous system. He believed repeated actions increase the plasticity of neural matter. In other words, repetition changes the nervous system in ways that make future action easier. This idea anticipates later thinking about learning, automaticity, and neural plasticity. For James, habit helps individuals persist in activities even when those activities are difficult or disagreeable. Habit can support discipline. It can support adaptation. It can also trap people in patterns. So habit is powerful. And once again, James is thinking functionally. What does this process do for the organism? Part 13, James's influence. Thousands of students and psychologists were affected by the theories James developed in the Principles of Psychology. His work shifted the new science of psychology away from the structuralist view and toward the formal founding of functionalism. He did not create a school with disciples in the usual sense. He did not build a laboratory empire like Wundt. He was not a systematic experimentalist, but he changed the field by changing its imagination. He made psychology broader, more adaptive, more alive, more connected to biology, emotion, habit, selfhood, and practical life. He made consciousness flow again. Instead of treating the mind as a collection of elements, he treated mental life as a living process. That is why James matters. Part 14, Pulling It All Together. Dr. Jekyll. So let's pull this together. James was a contradiction. He was central to American scientific psychology, but he was also interested in mystical and spiritual phenomena that many psychologists wanted to exclude. He was not a strict experimentalist, but he helped define psychology as a science of mental life. He criticized introspection, but he still used it. He accepted experimentation, but he refused to limit psychology to it. He emphasized biology and the brain, but also emotion, self, spirituality, and practical life. He rejected structuralism's elementism and argued that consciousness is not a bundle of parts. It is a stream, continuous, selective, changing, adaptive, embodied, personal. James gave functionalism its spirit. He helped psychology ask, what does the mind do? How does consciousness help us adapt? How do habits shape behavior? How does the body shape emotion? How is the self built from body, society, and inner life? And how should psychology study living people in a living world? Those questions changed American psychology. The big takeaway from today's episode is that psychology changed through argument, measurement, method, and cultural pressure. The names matter. William James matters, Wundt matters, Titchener matters, Cattell matters, Peirce matters, Lange matters, Darwin still matters here too. But the pattern matters more. Each figure or school is responding to a problem left behind by the last one. Structuralism tried to analyze consciousness into parts. James argued that consciousness is a living stream. Wundt and Titchener emphasized elements, methods, and structure. James emphasized function, adaptation, choice, habit, and lived experience. Darwin made adaptation central. James brought adaptation into American psychology's understanding of mind. And with James, psychology becomes more than the study of mental structure. It becomes the study of mental life in motion. That's it for today. Keep your curiosity sharp, and I'll see you in the next episode. This is Dr. Jackal, signing off.